The snow was white when she knelt beside him, red by the time she stood a stranger, unconscious. Too large to move and too close to dead to leave, she looked at the trees, looked at the road, looked at the man bleeding into the Montana ground like he had nowhere better to be. She brought him home anyway. That was her first mistake, or her first act of grace. In Dillon, Montana, 1883, nobody could agree on the difference, because the next morning, a letter arrived, a number on it that made her hands go still. A deadline, a name she recognized, and somewhere in the hills above the valley, men with torches were already saddling their horses. She didn't know that yet. She was still inside, making coffee for two. The land did not forgive weakness, and Ruth Hadley had stopped asking it to. She had understood this the winter she buried George, when the ground froze so hard that the gravediggers needed 2 full days and a borrowed pickaxe to get down 6 feet. She had stood at the edge of that hole in her good black dress, the one she'd worn exactly twice in 8 years of marriage, and she had not cried heat. Not because she felt nothing, because what she felt was too tangled to separate into anything as clean as grief, and she had never been a woman who performed emotions she hadn't fully sorted out. George Hadley had been a careful man, careful with money, careful with words, careful with affection in the way some men were careful with good tools kept them put away where they wouldn't get worn down by ordinary use. 8 years of marriage, and Ruth had learned to read the temperature of a room by the set of his jaw before he opened his mouth. A tight jaw meant silence at supper. A jaw that had forgotten to be tight meant he might ask how her day had gone, which was as close to tenderness as George Hadley generally got. She had told herself for a long time that this was enough. Standing at his grave with the November wind coming down off the Bitterroot, she was no longer sure what she had been telling herself or why. The town of Dillon moved on from George Hadley the way small Montana towns moved on from unremarkable men, not unkindly, but efficiently. By December, his name had stopped coming up at the feed store. By January, the pastor had recycled his eulogy for old Terence Purcell, who died of a tooth that went bad and took the rest of him with it. By February, Ruth was simply the widow Hadley who lived out past the Cottonwood Bend on Dillon Flats, and people said her name with the particular softness reserved for women they pitied, but didn't know what to do with practically. She was 32 years old. She did not feel pitied. She felt behind on fencing and dangerously low on both flour and patience, and those were the problems she intended to address. The morning the letter came, the first real snow of October had fallen overnight, thin and tentative, barely enough to cover the dead grass, but enough to make the world look clean in a way it hadn't earned. Ruth stood on the porch in her canvas work coat, the one with the fraying left cuff she kept meaning to fix, and looked out at Dillon Flats, spreading away from her in every direction, 160 acres. Her name on the deed. George's name first, then hers, but hers was on it, or so she had believed. The envelope was plain. No return address. Inside, the letter bore the printed header of the First Territorial Bank of Dillon, and beneath that, in the tidy, indifferent script of a man who signed his name to other people's disasters every working day, Clement Farrow had written that the outstanding balance on the mortgage instrument, dated March 14, 1882, signed by Mr. George Hadley, presently stood at $860, payable in full within 60 days. She read it twice, then a third time, because surely she had misread something. Surely there was a different Mrs. Hadley. Surely her husband of 8 years had not mortgaged their land without mentioning it to her once. Not once, not in passing, not even in the weeks he lay sick and burning and she sat beside him through the nights, not even then, when the world was ending and there was nothing left to be careful about. $860. She folded the letter, put it in her coat pocket, looked out at the snow. Across the valley, maybe 2 miles east, through the cottonwoods, the roofline of something large was barely visible in the morning haze. Red tile, or what looked like red tile at this distance. A ranch, big enough to be seen from here, which meant big enough to matter in a county where size was the only currency that counted long-term. She'd noticed it before and never given it particular thought. George hadn't talked about neighbors. George hadn't talked about much. She went inside, made coffee, waited until she was warm enough to be properly angry, because some problems needed to be approached from a position of strength, and anger without warmth was just cold. The anger came right on schedule. Clement Farrow arrived at 9:30, which was a choice. 9:30 was late enough that a working woman would already be in the fields, which meant arriving then was a statement. I don't need an appointment because this is already mine. He was a broad man gone soft in the middle, his belly pressing comfortably against the buttons of a wool vest that cost more than Ruth made in a month, selling eggs and the occasional side of salt pork. His horse was a well-fed bay gelding that announced its owner's prosperity before its owner opened his mouth. Behind him, on a grey mare, rode a man Ruth didn't recognize, tall, narrow as a fence post, eyes the color of mud after rain, sitting in a face so still it looked like something had been removed deliberately. He wore a coat that had been military once, long ago, before someone stripped the insignia and left just the shape of authority without any accountability attached. His hands rested loose on the reins, relaxed in the way that hands got relaxed when deliberate calm had been practiced long enough to become automatic. Ruth came off the porch to meet them before they reached the door, because whatever was about to happen, she wanted it in open air where it was harder to misrepresent later. Pharaoh dismounted with the practiced ease of a man who assumed the ground rearranged itself to receive him. He removed his hat, smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes, which were small and brown and perpetually calculating, like a man always running arithmetic in his head and always coming out a little ahead. Ruth, warm the way a coal stove was warm useful until it burned you. I hope the letter didn't cause undue alarm. These things are never as dire as they appear on paper. In my experience, they're usually worse in person. She kept her hands in her coat pockets. You could have sent your clerk. I wanted to deliver it personally. Out of respect for George is in frozen ground. He's past needing respect. She looked past Pharaoh at the thin man on the grey mare. What's his name? Pharaoh half turned. Silas Cobb. He assists me with various matters. Silas Cobb had not moved, had not blinked, near as Ruth could tell. He looked at her the way you looked at a door you were eventually going to have to open, not with hostility exactly, but with the patience of someone who had decided the outcome before arriving and was simply waiting for the sequence to play out. Ruth held his gaze for 3 full seconds, then looked back at Pharaoh. I'll need to see the original instrument, she said. The document George signed with the bank's stamp and the original figures. Not whatever version ends up in a subsequent envelope. Something moved behind Pharaoh's eyes. A recalibration, fast and then gone. Naturally, he said, and his smile adjusted to the version he used when things weren't going precisely as planned. He replaced his hat and settled it with the small deliberate gesture of a man centering himself before he continued. There are other parties interested in this area, Ruth. People who aren't as patient as I am. I'd hate for you to find yourself dealing with less friendly circumstances. He mounted and turned his horse toward the road. Silas Cobb did not turn immediately. He sat the grey mare and looked at Ruth for one more moment, measured the moment precisely, then let it go. Then he turned and followed Pharaoh down the road without a word, and the sound of hooves on the frozen dirt faded, and Ruth stood in the thin October snow and thought about what patience looked like when someone used it as a weapon. She went inside and wrote down everything that had been said, in order, while it was still exact in her memory. George had told her once that the first person to write down what happened in a room controlled what that room meant afterward. It was the most useful thing he'd ever told her, and she was beginning to understand that useful things from George came in small and widely spaced supply. She made a second pot of coffee. She did not allow herself to think about the number on the letter until she had drunk half of it. Then she thought about it hard and straight and without flinching. The way she thought about things that frightened her, not avoiding the edges but mapping them precisely. Because you couldn't address something whose shape you hadn't established. $860. 60 days. December 1st, she put on her work coat and went to fix the coop latch, because the coop latch had been failing for 2 weeks and the chickens weren't going to wait for her financial crisis to resolve itself. The next morning she found the tracks. She nearly missed them. She'd been up before light to check on June, the older of her 2 milking cows, named after her own mother for reasons she'd long stopped trying to justify, and was walking back from the pen when the low angle of the early sun caught something in the snow near the wellhead. Footprints, not small ones. The stride was long and the depth of the impression suggested real weight, not a lean man passing through. They came from the direction of the north fence line, stopped at the wellhead in a compressed cluster that meant someone had stood there for a while, then went back toward the trees. Ruth stood at the wellhead and looked north. The bitterroot was dark, and still at this hour the aspens bare, the pines holding their color above the snowline. Nothing moved except a crow making its general case against the morning from somewhere in the cottonwoods. Someone had come to the well in the night, from the trees, not from the road, had stood here, and then left. She pumped the handle, filled her bucket, went back to the house with the question of those footprints in her other hand, and spent the morning not quite setting it down. By mid-morning the sky had closed over with the flat, purposeful gray of clouds that weren't threatening, they had already decided. Snow began at noon, steady and committed. Ruth had been out fixing the coop latch since 10, her fingers growing clumsy despite her wool gloves, and she'd been about to go in when she thought of June again, the north fence. She'd meant to check it after the coop. 3 rails were down on the north side, had been down since August, and she'd been propping up her intention to fix them with the same optimism that had carried her through most of the year. In this weather, if June had pushed through, which she had the structural stubbornness to do when sufficiently motivated by boredom or spite, she'd wander toward the trees and be hard to track before dark. Ruth went to check the fence. June was not in the pen. The middle rail on the north side had been knocked through, one end dragging a groove in the snow that pointed exactly where Ruth had feared. She got the long rope from the barn, got Dusty from the corral, 17 years old, and expressive about cold weather, through a system of sighs that were unsettlingly human, and followed June's trail north. The cow had gone perhaps 300 yards into the trees before running out of enthusiasm for the whole enterprise. She'd stopped at a natural clearing where the snow was thinner under the pine canopy, and she was eating bark off a low aspen with the focused satisfaction of an animal that had decided this was fine. Actually, everything was perfectly fine. Ruth tied the rope to June's halter and turned Dusty to head back. That was when she saw him, 20 feet away, at the base of a pine old enough that 2 men couldn't have put their arms around it, lying on his side in the snow, and not small. Even lying down, even half buried, you could see the scale of him, the breadth of the shoulder extending above the snow, the length of the leg. He wore a coat made of deer hide, the leather worn pale and soft with years of use and weather, the color of old cream where it wasn't dark with blood. A long knife in a wood-handled sheath at his hip, boots heavy and laced with rawhide. A wide-brimmed hat of dark brown leather had fallen from his head and lay in the snow a few feet away, as though it had been knocked loose by something coming fast. Along the right side of his face, starting at the cheekbone and curving toward the jaw, 3 parallel lines, deep and ugly and dark at the edges where the blood had dried in the cold, claw marks. Not from something small, from something that meant it. His chest was moving, barely. But moving. Ruth sat on Dusty's back and had the following argument with herself in approximately 15 seconds. He was a stranger. He was large enough to cause serious harm if he woke up inclined to. She was a mile from her house, alone in thickening snow, with an elderly horse and an emotionally unreliable cow. The practical thing, the thing George would have called the only reasonable thing, was to turn Dusty around and go back. She had enough problems already. She had a letter with a number on it that clenched something in her chest every time she thought about it. She had 60 days and a leaking kitchen ceiling and 3 fence rails down and a sick cow, and no margin for anything that wasn't strictly necessary. The man in the snow made a sound. Not words, not a call for help, just the low, involuntary sound of a body that had been in pain long enough that not even unconsciousness could suppress it entirely. His lips had gone the pale gray blue of someone who had been cold for a long time. Ruth dismounted. Getting him onto Dusty was not a graceful operation. He was heavy the way structural things were heavy, not just mass but density, built for stability rather than movement. The first approach, looping her arms under his to lift his upper body, put her down on one knee in the snow where she stayed for a 10 count, recalibrating. The second approach involved rope, Dusty's considerable reluctance, and a sustained low conversation with herself that she was glad no one was around to hear. He didn't help, he wasn't conscious enough to help. When she moved him, he made sounds, deep and involuntary, that told her he was alive and had nerve endings, and that she needed to be both faster and more careful, which was a combination requiring more coordination than the situation was making easy. By the time she had him draped across Dusty's back, face down, ungainly, his boots dragging at one side and his arms hanging at the other. Ruth's coat was soaked at the knees, and her breath was coming hard in white bursts. June regarded the entire operation from the end of her rope with the expression of an animal that had seen many things and had opinions about all of them. Not a word, Ruth told the cow. She led Dusty home through the thickening snow, one hand on the reins and one pressed against the stranger's back to keep him balanced, and tried not to think too specifically about what she was doing or why. Inside, fire first, then light, then the work of getting him off the horse and onto the floor in front of the hearth. He was partly conscious by then, one large hand groping vaguely at nothing, a low sound in his chest when she shifted his weight. She got him on his back on the braided rug, which had belonged to George's mother and had survived everything that had happened in this house so far, and took stock. The claw marks on his face she could clean and bind. 3 lines, deep enough to scar but not deep enough to threaten anything vital. They had bled and stopped, which meant his blood was still doing its job despite the cold. The wound at his left side was the problem. Not a gash, more a deep bruising and tearing where something had caught him along the ribs. The flesh dark and swollen in a way that told her the damage was mostly inward. She pressed carefully along his side and felt the wrong kind of movement at 2 spots, not the clean snap of a fully broken rib, but the unstable give of cracked ones, the cartilage between them compromised. His body would splint itself over time if she kept him still and gave it the chance to do so. The risk was the same risk as with any cracked rib. If he moved wrong and drove the edge of the bone into something it wasn't meant to touch, the situation would become one she couldn't manage alone. She packed the wound with clean cloth and a poultice of pine resin and beeswax, her grandmother's formula, which she had been making since she was 12, and which she had found more reliable than half of what passed for medicine in Dillon. She bound his ribs with strips of linen, firm enough to support without restricting his breathing further. Cleaned the claw marks on his face with water from the kettle, her hand steady even when the cuts proved deeper in places than the dim firelight had suggested. He stayed unconscious through most of it, which was better for both of them. When she had done what she could do, she sat in the chair across the room with George's rifle across her knees and looked at him in the firelight and did what you did when you had just made a significant decision and were waiting to find out whether it was the right one. He was large, indoors, in the small front room of a house not built with men of this scale in mind. The fact of his size was impossible to overlook. The deer-hide coat had disguised it somewhat outside. Bulk was just bulk. In here it translated differently. The shoulders, even relaxed in unconsciousness, nearly spanned the width of the braided rug. The hands were outsized even for the frame, the knuckles carrying the layered scars of someone who had done heavy work for a long time with no particular delicacy about it. The hunting knife she'd left in its sheath, removing it from a man of that size, had seemed like a calculation with worse odds than leaving it. The wood handle worn smooth at the grip from years of the same hand. His face, cleaned of blood, was not young but not old either. Somewhere in the middle of a life that had done things to it. The dark beard was thick and untrimmed in the way of a man who had stopped thinking about it, rather than a man who had decided to grow one, a distinction that Ruth, who had learned to read men through small things, recognized clearly. Whatever this man had been doing in the Bitterroot, he had been doing it long enough to stop maintaining himself against any standard except survival. Then she saw the ring, right hand, 4th finger, a silver band, substantial, not decorative weight but working weight, the kind made to last through everything. She held his hand toward the firelight to read the inside of the band, tilting it until the letters caught the light. BHWC. Not a wedding ring. Wrong hand, wrong finger, wrong configuration for a wedding band. Something else. A claim or a reminder, or both, the kind of thing made when something important needed to be carried on the body rather than left somewhere it could be lost. BH were not his initials. WC might be. She set his hand down, looked at the fire, thought about the roofline she'd seen that morning 2 miles east through the cottonwoods. Thought about what Farrow had said. There are other parties interested in this area. Thought about the initials and the weight of the ring and the quality of the knife and the deer-hide coat worn to softness by years rather than fashion. She picked up the rifle again and settled back into the chair and did not let herself draw conclusions from incomplete information, which was a discipline she had been practicing since the letter arrived, and which was becoming easier with repetition. The fire burned. The snow pressed against the windows. The man on the rug breathed slowly, and she kept watch, and the night moved through its hours without incident. He woke just past midnight. The change in his breathing reached her first from the slow, effortful rhythm of deep unconsciousness to something more deliberate, more controlled. She was already sitting forward when his eyes opened. Dark green in the firelight. More olive than straight green, the kind of color that would change depending on what it sat next to. They opened and immediately focused, which was not what she'd expected. Not the blinking confusion of someone surfacing from deep sleep. He looked at the ceiling, then at the fire, then at her and the rifle, and all three looks had the same quality, present, cataloging, making sense of things in sequence. He was assessing, not panicking, not threatening, just taking stock. She kept the rifle where it was. The fire made its sounds. Outside, the wind had picked up and was working on the north side of the house with a kind of patient insistence. Neither of them spoke for a moment. His voice, when it came, was low and rough in the way of a hinge that needed working. "Where am I?" "Hadley Place. Dillon Flats. North of town if you need the direction." He looked at the ceiling again, then back at her. His gaze moved to the rifle, registered it, moved back. "You brought me in, I had a horse." She did most of the actual lifting. His chest rose and fell carefully, testing the situation from the inside. She saw the exact moment he found the bound ribs, a slight tightening around the eyes, quickly pressed back down. How bad? 2 cracked ribs. Not broken through cracked. The cartilage between them is compromised, which means if you move wrong you'll drive the edge into something that won't forgive it. The wound at your side I've packed and bound. The cuts on your face will heal and scar. She paused. I'd say you were lucky, but I'm not sure the bear would agree. Something in his face, not quite amusement. The shadow of it, which was the most she suspected, he offered easily. "Bear," he said, confirming, not questioning. "The marks on your face are claw marks. Whatever got to your ribs came from the same direction." It was a large animal that moved fast. She paused. "You were alone up there?" "Yes." "For how long?" He looked at the fire. A look that was its own kind of answer. "A while," he said. She let that sit. "Is there anyone who knows I'm here?" he said. The way he asked it, not nervous, not worried. Something more like careful. The quality of a man checking a variable that mattered to him, wanting to be sure of the answer before he organized his thinking around it. Ruth studied him for a moment. "No," she said. Something shifted in him. Not visible in his face, but somewhere lower, in the chest and the shoulders. A release of something that had been held. "Good," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Is it?" He met her gaze. A considering look, not sizing up the threat but the person, deciding something about her based on what he saw. "Wade," he said. She understood it was a name, Ruth. He tried to sit up, made it approximately 3 inches before the ribs sent a message he couldn't ignore. His jaw set. He lowered himself back down with the deliberate care of a man who was deeply annoyed at his own body. "The ribs need more than 1 night before you start testing them," she said. "I've had cracked ribs before." "Then you know they don't negotiate." She stood, set the rifle against the wall close enough to reach, far enough not to be aggressive, and went to the kitchen. She came back with a tin cup of water, set it on the floor within reach of his hand. He looked at the cup, then at her, then, with no change in expression, he picked it up and drank. Carefully, in small amounts, the way someone drank who understood that his body was currently making decisions, and he'd better work with them rather than against them. When he was finished, he set the cup down and closed his eyes. The firelight moved across his face. After a moment, without opening his eyes, he said, "I'll be out of your way by morning." "You won't. I've had cracked ribs." "Yes." She settled back into the chair. "You'll be out of my way when your ribs permit it. Until then, you'll stay where you are and not undo the work I put into you, and we'll both sleep better for it." He was quiet. "Besides," she added, "you're too heavy to move twice." The corner of his mouth moved. Just slightly. The ghost of something. "Fair enough," he said, in the tone of a man conceding a point to someone who has earned it. Ruth looked at the fire and thought about the ring, and BH, and what it stood for, and did not ask. In the morning he was still there. She'd half expected otherwise. She'd woken twice in the night to sounds of him shifting, and once she'd been certain she heard him try to rise, and then quiet again. But she came out at 5 in the morning and found him exactly as she'd left him, flat on his back on the rug with one arm over his eyes. She started the fire, put the coffee on. The smell of it changed his breathing from across the room. She brought him a cup. He worked himself to sitting slowly, building it from the inside out, incrementally, and made it. Sat with his forearms on his bent knees, breathing with the deliberate rhythm of someone monitoring the ribs with every inhale. He took the coffee without ceremony and held it in both hands and looked at the fire. And for a little while neither of them said anything, which was not uncomfortable. Then he looked up and said, "You have a hinge on that door that's been pulling loose." She looked at the front door. Then back at him. He looked at the fire. "I heard it in the night. The scraping, I know about it. There's a way to fix it without replacing the plate." She studied him for a moment. He was looking at his coffee with the expression of a man who had said something without meaning to say quite that much, and was hoping the remark would be absorbed quietly. "Yes," she said, "there is." She went back to making breakfast and did not say anything further about the hinge. That afternoon she came in from checking the south fence to find the front door standing precisely as it always stood, at its usual angle, but no longer scraping. She pressed her hand along the top of the frame. Someone had shimmed the plate with a thin strip of wood, the kind of field repair you made when you had the eye for what was wrong and the hands to address it, and no reason to wait for a hardware order. She turned around. Wade was at the far wall, lowering himself back onto the rug with the careful economy of a man who had done more than his ribs had agreed to and was settling accounts. He didn't look at her. She didn't comment. She went back to the kitchen and thought about what it meant when a man who was supposed to be resting fixed the thing that was making a noise in the night. The second day, she came out from the barn to find him at the roof edge, moving along the eave with the deliberate pace of a man who was in pain and had decided not to let it make decisions for him. He had found the pitch in the barn without being told it was there. He was doing the east side of the roof where she'd noticed the shingles had lifted. "You shouldn't be up there," she said. He didn't look down. "It needs doing before the next snow. Your ribs are managing." He moved to the next shingle. "The left side is worse than the right. I'm keeping weight off the left." She stood in the yard and looked up at him for a moment. A very large man in a worn deer-hide coat, navigating her roof in the October cold with careful geometry. "Come down when it's done," she said. Not a moment before, but also not a moment after. He came down when it was done, came inside and sat down and accepted the coffee she brought without elaborating on whether the ribs had managed as well as he'd predicted, and she didn't ask, because asking would have required him to either admit it or lie, and neither option served anyone. The third day, she found a rabbit outside the kitchen door at dawn, cleaned and ready, without any discussion of who had left it or when. She cooked it for supper and set 2 plates on the table, and didn't say anything about the rabbit, and he didn't say anything about the plates, and they ate without much conversation, but with the easy lack of friction of 2 people who had arrived. Without formally deciding to, at a set of mutual understandings after supper he carved. She'd told him he could take from the log pile, and he'd selected a piece of pine that fit his hand, and worked it with the belt knife, the same knife that had been at his hip when she found him. The wood handle as worn as everything else he owned. She watched his hands from across the room, the concentration in them, the thing taking shape in the wood, still rough but beginning to suggest its own form. "You've been in the Bitterroot a long time," she said. He kept his eyes on the wood. "Yes, by choice, yes. What's up there?" The carving knife made its small sound against the grain. "Quiet," he said. She looked at the fire. "That's one word for it. It's the word that fits." She was quiet for a moment. "You're not from here originally, eastern Montana. Raised near Miles City." He turned the wood, examined the angle of it, took a careful stroke. "Came west when I was 22. Built something. Then stopped building it," he said it flatly. Not as an invitation to go further, not as a refusal either, and now? He glanced at her briefly, the dark green eyes in the firelight, then back at the wood. "Now I'm sitting in your kitchen," which was true, and was also not an answer, and she understood the difference and let it be. That night she looked out her bedroom window and saw him on the porch steps in the cold, the deer-hide coat on, sitting with his arms on his knees and his eyes on the northern dark the mountains. Invisible now, but present the way things you knew by heart were always present. Not watching for anything, not waiting for anything, just looking in the direction of something he'd left behind and wasn't ready yet to have a named feeling about. She watched him for a moment. Then she went to bed. She slept poorly. But that was not new. The following morning Silas Cobb came back, She heard the horses first too this time, moving at the same measured pace she'd recognized before. She was at the kitchen window when they came around the cottonwood bend, Cobb on the grey mare. One other man broad in the way of someone paid to take up space. She looked at the front room. Wade was on the rug, upright against the hearth, the carving in his hands. He had heard the horses too. He looked at her. She looked at him. "The man named Cobb," she said. "He works for the bank. He was here before." Wade set the carving down, looked at the door. She could see him taking the measure of the situation the same way he'd taken the measure of everything since she'd found him, not with alarm, but with the quiet, systematic attention of a man who understood that an unexamined situation was a situation you hadn't yet decided to be responsible for. Then he stood up, not fast. The ribs had their say in it, but he stood, and when he was standing in the small front room, the room organized itself around him differently. The ceiling was 8 feet, and he had room above his head, but not the kind of room that made the ceiling feel comfortably distant. He moved to stand just inside the door, slightly behind and to the left of it. Not hiding, just present. A fact about the room that hadn't been a fact before. Ruth opened the door before Cobb could knock. He sat the grey mare at the base of the porch steps. The second man waited back by the corral gate. Cobb looked at her with those mud-colored eyes that took everything in and gave nothing back. "Mrs. Hadley," his voice was dry as old lumber. "Mr. Farrow asked me to check in. Make sure the letter arrived without difficulty." It arrived, good. "We've also had some reports of unusual activity in the area. Tracks north of the tree line, up toward the foothills. Mr. Farrow wanted to make sure you weren't having any trouble." The pause before trouble was small and deliberate. "No trouble," Ruth said. His gaze moved past her left shoulder. Into the room, she held still. Held his gaze when it came back to her. The shadow Wade cast through the open doorway was long and wide. The shadow of a man who had not stepped forward and had not stepped back. Cobb looked at the shadow. His eyes did a small thing, not fear, because Silas Cobb probably didn't have a simple relationship with fear. A recalculation, rapid and nearly invisible. "You've got company," he said. "My cousin," Ruth said. "From Butte. Down for a Cobb looked at her for another moment. His expression carried nothing definitive. He gathered his reins with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had noted everything he came to note. "Mr. Farrow mentioned that 60 days moves faster than people expect," he said. He touched the brim of his hat, the courtesy of a man who understood the forms without necessarily endorsing them, and turned the grey mare and rode back the way he'd come, the second man falling in behind. Ruth closed the door. She turned around. Wade was looking at her. Not up with the assessment he'd turned on her the first morning, not with the calculation of a man deciding how worried to be. Something else. Something that was working something out about her specifically. "You said cousin," he said. Not accusing. Genuinely asking. She looked at him for a moment. "I don't know why," she said, which was the truth, and which surprised her slightly more than it seemed to surprise him. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he picked up the carving from the floor and sat back down against the hearth and went back to work. And the room settled into the particular quiet of two people who had, without formally negotiating it, arrived at some kind of decision about each other. That evening she found the note. She almost missed it entirely. The wind had been working the door all afternoon, and a folded scrap of paper could have been sitting in the gap of the doorframe since noon or since 2 minutes ago, she couldn't know. And it didn't matter because it was there now, wedged at the angle of someone who wanted it found but didn't want to knock. Plain paper, torn at one edge. Pencil, pressed hard, written without a flat surface under it. 5 words. "Leave before it's too late." No signature, nothing on the other side. Ruth stood on the porch with the note in her hand and looked at the road and the tree line and the thin October dark coming down off the mountains, and thought about Silas Cobb's eyes and Clement Farrow's arithmetic and the 60 days that were already ticking, and the 7 families Pearl would tell her about in 4 days' time, which she didn't know about yet, and the territorial records in Helena that would take Greer 2 weeks to access, which she also didn't know about yet. What she knew right now was the number on the bank letter, the note in her hand, and the man inside her house with the ring on his finger she hadn't asked about. She folded the note, put it in her coat pocket with the bank letter, went inside. Wade looked up from across the room. She crossed to him and held out the note without explanation. He took it, read it, folded it back along its original creases and held it for a moment, looking at it. He did not ask who had left it, did not suggest it was time for him to go, did not tell her not to worry, which she was grateful for, because she was not a woman who found false reassurance reassuring. What he did was set the folded note on the floor beside him and look at the fire, and then look at her with those dark green eyes in the low firelight. And in that look was something she recognized without being able to name, yet the look of a man who was running numbers on a debt, the kind of debt that couldn't be settled in cash, and had arrived at the conclusion that the numbers were not in his favor and something was going to have to be done about it. She sat in her chair, put her feet toward the fire, picked up the mending she'd set down 3 days ago. Neither of them said anything. But the silence had the quality of two people who have agreed on something without speaking, which is the kind of agreement that tends to hold. She went to Pearl Dawson's shop before she went anywhere else, because Pearl was the kind of woman who knew the difference between what people said and what they meant, and right now Ruth needed someone who operated fluently in that gap. The dress shop sat between the hardware store and the post office on Dillon's Main Street, which was 3 blocks of storefronts doing their collective best against the Montana winter. The bell above the door made its small sound when Ruth pushed through. Inside, the smell of fabric sizing and the faint sweetness of cedar blocks Pearl kept in every corner against moths. Bolts of cloth on the back shelves in the practical colors that women in cattle country ordered: dark blues, serviceable grays, the occasional burgundy for someone feeling hopeful about something. Pearl herself was at the cutting table, pins in her lower lip, a length of black wool spread before her. 63 years old, gray hair pinned with the no-nonsense efficiency of a woman who had stopped being interested in hair arrangements sometime around 1870. Eyes like good coffee brown and direct and with no patience for cooling. She looked up, removed the pins from her mouth, set them in the cushion at her wrist. "Sit down," she said, which was how Pearl started every serious conversation, because she believed that people made better decisions when they weren't on their feet feeling like they might need to run somewhere. Ruth sat. She put the bank letter and the unsigned note on the cutting table without preamble, in that order. Pearl read them both. Took her time. Her face did not change dramatically, but the lines around her mouth tightened in the small, particular way of a woman confirming something she'd already suspected and wasn't pleased to be right about. She set the letters down, folded her hands on top of them. "George's note," she said. "What number did your copy show?" $430. Pearl nodded once. The nod of someone doing arithmetic they'd hoped not to have to do. "Hetty Marsh," she said. "You know her out past the Conley place." Ruth knew her. Substantial woman, iron gray braid, husband named Bernard, who bred quarter horses and had made his peace with the world largely by keeping quiet about it. Bernard signed a note with Farrow 2 years ago, Pearl said. $400 for equipment. He paid it down to $250 in the first year. Then a letter came saying the balance was $600. She let the number sit on the table between them. Bernard's copy said $250. Farrow's copy said $600. Bernard went to the courthouse in Beaverhead County and asked to see the filing. The filing said $600. The original had been replaced. Pearl confirmed, with the flat finality of someone closing a door on a room that shouldn't have been opened. Bernard's not a man given to making scenes. He sold 60 acres on the south side of his property to cover the difference and has not spoken of it since. She paused. The 60 acres Farrow bought from him border the valley floor. Right along the creek bed. Ruth looked at her steadily. The railroad. Pearl's expression shifted into something that occupied the territory between satisfaction and grimness without settling in either. "You've heard the talk. Enough of it." Farrow mentioned other parties interested in the area. He was too careful to say what kind of interest. "I saw survey maps," Pearl said, 6 weeks ago, through the window of a room above the hotel, while delivering a repaired waistcoat to a man who did not think I could read upside down at 6 feet. She touched the edge of the bank letter. Utah and Northern Railroad. Their current line runs north through Beaverhead County. The proposed spur would come southeast through the valley right through the bottom land along the creek bed. The Marsh property, the Connolly place on the north side. The Bellamy farm to the east. She held Ruth's gaze. "Your South 40, Ruth. The land along your creek boundary. The South 40 was the best soil on the property. Ruth had been planning, vaguely for years, to put wheat in it when she had the hands and the capital. Good soil, water access, flat enough to work efficiently. Railroad land. How many families, Ruth said, that I know of with certainty? 5, including yours. Pearl said it the way she said anything that made her angry, flat and factual. The anger compressed into pure delivery. There may be more who haven't come to me. More who don't know yet that their paperwork has been adjusted. She picked up her pins. Not because she intended to sew immediately, but because her hands needed something to do with the information they were holding. What are you going to do? Find Amos Greer? Pearl looked at her. He's old. He's also the only lawyer within 40 miles who doesn't owe Farrow a courtesy. Ruth stood, folded both letters back into her coat. Where is he at this hour? Hotel dining room. Noon every day for 15 years. Boiled bee on Tuesdays. This is Tuesday. It is, Pearl said and reached for her cutting shears. Then without looking up, Ruth, there's a man at your place. Ruth stopped, turned. Pearl was looking at her with the eyes of a woman who had spent 40 years watching things that other people thought they were concealing. Silas Cobb came in here yesterday asking whether I'd seen any strangers come down from the hills in the past week. What did you tell him? That I was very busy. Pearl made the first cut in the black wool, clean and straight. I'm always very busy when Silas Cobb asks me questions. Ruth buttoned her coat, looked at the door, looked back. His name is Wade, she said. He fixed the north fence. Pearl said nothing. But something in her face said a great many things simultaneously, in the efficient way of a woman who had learned that the most significant observations were usually better left as observations. Ruth went to find Amos Greer. He was, in fact, at the hotel dining room, boiled beef, a glass of water, a newspaper folded to the inside pages, which he preferred on principle because the front page, he'd once told her at George's funeral, had contained nothing original since 1871. He was 71 years old and narrow as a fence rail, with a white mustache he maintained with a precision that stood in pointed contrast to the general productive disorder of everything else about him. He'd been a prosecuting attorney in Kansas before a land dispute ended with him being shot in the left knee at close range, which finished both the dispute and his career in Kansas, and eventually deposited him in Dillon, where the elevation was kinder to the knee and no one knew enough of his history to have formed opinions about it. He looked up when she sat down across from him, looked at her face, set the newspaper aside without marking his place. What's happened? He said. She put the bank letter on the table. He read it. She told him about Pearl's account of the Marsh family, about the changed filing, about the survey maps and the railroad spur and the 5 families she knew of, and probably more she didn't. She organized it in sequence without embellishment because Amos Greer was not a man who needed color to understand the shape of a problem. He needed facts arranged in order. He ate his boiled beef while she talked. She had learned, through the small number of interactions she'd had with him over the years, that this was not rudeness but the habit of a man who had learned to do 2 things at once and had long since stopped apologizing for the efficiency. When she finished, he set his fork down, put both hands flat on the table, looked at the letter, the original instrument, he said, the one George signed. You have your copy. $430. Dated March 14th, and Farrow's letter references the same instrument by the same date. With $860, he picked up both letters. Read them in order. Set them down. On its own, not conclusive. A court could interpret the discrepancy as a copy error on your end. He looked at her. But if Farrow's records show one number and the county filing shows the same number, one of 2 things follows. Either your copy is genuinely in error, or Farrow has a relationship at the county office that has been useful to him. He paused. Given that Clement Farrow has been in this valley for 12 years and has had ample opportunity to cultivate the kinds of friendships that are useful at county offices, the second possibility warrants examination. Is there a record that predates the county filing? Something moved in his eyes. Not excitement. Greer was too experienced for excitement. The focused interest of a man whose mind had just engaged with a problem at the level it liked to operate. The Territorial Land Office in Helena maintains independent records. When a mortgage instrument is filed at the county, there's a secondary registry in Helena, not always complete, not always current, but it exists. If the original registration of your land was filed independently when George first acquired the property, there may be corresponding records that predate the mortgage filing by years. He paused. That would require a query to Helena. How long? By telegraph. Days. I'll send through the hotel today, not through the post office, because Mrs. Terrell at the post office is Pharaoh's wife's second cousin by marriage, and has been for some years. He picked up his water glass. In the meantime, don't sign anything. Don't respond to Pharaoh's correspondence in writing. If anyone representing the bank approaches you, you tell them you have retained counsel and nothing further. Those exact words. Ruth nodded, and Ruth, he looked at her with the directness of a man who had spent 50 years saying difficult things without dressing them first. This won't be fast, and it won't be quiet. When Pharaoh understands you're not going to settle, he won't wait for the courts to decide things. He'll use Cobb, she said. Or something through Cobb. Greer looked at her for a moment with the evaluating attention he'd probably once used to size up witnesses. Then he nodded, picked up his newspaper, and found his page. I'll telegraph Helena this afternoon, he said, which was as close to a handshake as Amos Greer did. Ruth walked out of the hotel and into the October cold and stood on the plank sidewalk for a moment, letting the air be cold and the sky be gray, and the decision she'd made in the last 2 hours be what it was. Then she went back to the ranch. She was back before dark. Wade was at the new coop frame she'd started the rebuild 2 days ago with boards from the barn scrap pile. Slow progress, working the cross-bracing with the methodical patience of a man who had been given something useful to do with his hands and was not going to waste the opportunity. He moved carefully, the cracked ribs still governing the range of his left side, but steadily. He'd adapted his technique without commenting on the adaptation. She told him about Pearl, about Greer, about the railroad and the South 40 and the 5 families Pearl knew of. He listened the way he'd listened to everything completely, with his eyes on her face rather than on some middle distance which she had come to understand was not a performance of attention but the real thing. When she finished, the silence lasted several seconds. Then he said, "How many days to the Helena response?" Greer said days. "Maybe a week, and Pharaoh's deadline December 1st. We're at 43 days remaining." She had been counting without meaning to, the way you counted things that had a fixed endpoint when the endpoint mattered. Wade looked at the coop frame, then at the north fence line, then back at her. Something was moving behind his eyes, the same systematic working through she'd seen the morning after she brought him in, when he'd looked at the ceiling and the fire and her rifle and organized his situation in sequence. "Pharaoh already knows you haven't agreed to sell," he said. "He'll interpret the delay as resistance, which means he's already planning the next step. Whatever he does next won't be another conversation." She looked at him. "I know. I want you to know that I know it too," he said. Which was a specific thing to say, and he said it with the care of someone who was being precise about something that mattered. She went inside and started supper and thought about what it meant when a man said, "I know it too." The telegraph response from Helena came in 4 days. Greer sent word through Pearl, not through the post office, as agreed, and Ruth rode into Dillon on a Thursday morning to his office above the land agents on 2nd Street. The office smelled of paper and pipe tobacco long since gone cold, and the particular dry warmth of a room where someone had been working through documents for decades. Greer was at his desk when she arrived. He had the telegraph in his hand, and his expression had the quality of a man who had received confirmation of something he'd suspected, and found it both useful and infuriating. "The Territorial Land Office in Helena has a record of the original mortgage filing," he said, dated March 14th. "The figure recorded is $430. He set the telegraph on the desk and turned it toward her. "Not in a copy. In the filing itself." Ruth read it. "Read it again." "Pharaoh changed the number between the Helena filing and the county registration," she said, "or had it changed. The outcome is the same." Greer folded his hands. "This is now a matter of falsified financial instruments, which moves it from a civil dispute about a mortgage into something considerably more serious." He paused. "I'm filing a motion today. Request for injunctive relief, no foreclosure action against your property while the discrepancies is under formal examination. I'm also requesting a change of venue from Beaverhead County, where Pharaoh has cultivated his friendships, to a hearing here in Dillon before Judge Whitmore." "Whitmore," she said. "He and Pharaoh have not spoken since a water rights case in 1879. The details don't matter. What matters is that Whitmore owes Clement Pharaoh nothing, and has been known to find the man personally objectionable, which, in my experience, is the closest thing to guaranteed impartiality you're likely to find. Greer's mustache moved in something that might have been the very beginning of satisfaction. The hearing date I'm requesting is November 20th, Ruth calculated. The letter had arrived in the first days of October. 10 days had passed between receiving it and this morning, counting the days Wade had been at the ranch, the trip to Pearl, the waiting on Helena. That put her at just under 50 days remaining before December 1st. 11 days to the hearing left 39 days between the hearing and the deadline, enough room for the injunction to hold, not enough room to be comfortable about anything. 50 days, she said, give or take, 49 to be precise. Greer looked at her. The injunction, if granted, and I expect it will be, stops the clock on Farrow's foreclosure proceedings. December 1st becomes irrelevant while the matter is before the court. He paused. But we need the hearing first. Then we need the families. All 7, he said. Can you reach them? Pearl can reach 2 today. I'll go to the others. She stood, and Amos June recovered. My older cow. She was off her feed for most of October, but she came right by the end of the first week. She said it without fully knowing why, except that it felt important to note that one thing in October had resolved itself without requiring a fight. I thought you should know something went right. Greer looked at her over his mustache with the expression of a man who understood exactly why she'd said that. Good, he said. Hold on to that. He picked up his pen. Go to the families, she went. She spent the next 2 days covering the valley. Pearl took Hetty Marsh and the Connollys. Ruth took Clara Dunn, who ran sheep past the county line and turned out to be a small, fierce woman of about 60, with white hair cropped short and eyes the color of winter sky, who read the Helena records twice and then handed them back and said, I'll be there. Tell Greer I have my original letter and the bank's copy both, and the numbers differ by $310. I have never in my life thrown anything away. Ruth took the Bellamy farm, where the husband was skeptical until his wife Agnes asked 3 specific questions about the territorial records, and then said quietly that they would be at the hearing. And she took the Pruitt place north of town, where Vern Pruitt read the papers in the failing afternoon light at his fence line and asked, Is Whitmore the right judge, or does Farrow own a piece of him? Water rights case in 1879, Ruth said. They haven't spoken since. Greer's judgment or Greer's hope. Greer's judgment. He's been wrong about things. I don't think he's wrong about who he trusts. Vern Pruitt looked at her for a moment with the assessing eyes of a man who made his significant decisions outdoors. November 20th, he said. 9 o'clock, 7 families. The shape of the thing was clarifying. 49 days had felt like a wall in October. Now it felt like enough time to do what needed doing if she didn't waste any of it. She was back at the ranch by dark on the second day, tired in the deep way of someone who had been running on urgency and purpose all day and had come out the other side into the quieter country of exhaustion. She found Wade at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee already poured. She sat down and told him everything: the Helena confirmation, the hearing, the 7 families, what each of them had said. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he looked at his coffee and said, Farrow will know about the Helena records soon. He has connections in the territorial capital. Greer thinks days. Maybe less. And when he knows, he'll know the hearing is coming and what the record says. He paused. Which means the next 10 days are the ones that matter most. She looked at him across the table. The firelight from the main room moved at the edges of the kitchen. The coffee was good and the kitchen was warm, and outside the temperature was dropping toward the serious cold of a Montana November. He'll go to the families, she said. Make offers or threats dressed as offers. He needs to reduce 7 to fewer than will convince Whitmore. He'll start with Bernard Marsh, Wade said. Bernard already sold the 60 acres. Farrow will use that, tell him it's settled. There's nothing to fight for. The cost of fighting is higher than the cost of letting it go. He paused. And he'll leave Hetty for last, because Farrow is a man who reads rooms, and he's read Hetty Marsh at least once and knows she's not going to move for him. Ruth thought about Bernard Marsh, about the 60 acres he'd already given up, about the way his wife Hetty had not looked at him when she spoke of it, not with contempt, but with the precise control of a woman who had made a decision about what she was and was not going to say to her husband, and was maintaining that decision through visible effort. I'll go to Hetty tomorrow, she said. Not to shore her up, she doesn't need it. Just so she knows what's coming and isn't standing in it alone when it arrives. Wade nodded. His hands were around the coffee cup, still for once, not carving, not fixing, just holding something warm. "I'll go with you," he said. She looked at him across the table. "That may make things more complicated, or less complicated," he said. Depending on who's doing the complicating, she considered that. Then she picked up her coffee and drank it and said nothing more about it, which was its own kind of answer. They were asleep when the men came. Not the deep sleep of the untroubled Ruth had been sleeping in the particular light way of someone who had gone to bed knowing there was a reason to stay alert. One ear always partly in the room, the way she'd learned to sleep in the first year after George died, when every sound in the dark was potentially something she needed to address. She heard the horses before she was fully awake, and she heard what came after the too careful movement of men who were trying to be quiet and weren't quite quiet enough, and she was at the window before she'd consciously decided to move. The corral was still. The barn held its shape against the dark, and then she saw the light, not the steady yellow of a lantern, the moving warm orange of something burning. At the base of the chicken coop's south wall, where the old boards were driest, where the gap between the wall and the foundation let air in, her stomach went cold before the rest of her processed it. She went for her boots and her coat, George's rifle from the hook. She was outside in under a minute, the cold hitting her like a flat hand, and she could smell it before she could fully see it, the particular acrid sweetness of burning old pine, and under that, the smell of whatever they'd used to start it fast. 4 men. She counted them in the first second she had the whole picture. 2 crouched at the base of the coop wall, which was now burning in earnest, the dry wood taking with the enthusiasm of something that had been waiting. 1 standing near the corral gate, watching the road. 1 she hadn't placed yet. Somewhere in the shadow behind the water trough, Dusty was at the far end of the corral, eyes showing white in the firelight, moving in the tight, agitated circle of a horse that knew fire was close, but hadn't decided yet whether to panic. June was in the small pen attached to the south side of the barn. Ruth registered this in the same moment she registered the fire. Understood that June's pen shared a wall with the structure and that if the fire reached the barn's south face, the pen would go with it. The coop itself was gone already. She understood that in the same moment she saw it, understood that the structure was committed and she couldn't save it. What she could do was keep it from reaching the barn wall 12 feet away, and get Dusty clear, and get June clear, and not get shot. She raised the rifle. And then from the barn doorway, which she had not left open, which meant he had come through it from the inside, which meant he had been awake longer than she had, Wade Colton walked out into the firelight. He walked, not ran, not rushed. The deliberate, unhurried walk of a man who had already run the numbers on a situation and arrived at an outcome, and was now simply moving to stand inside it. The deer-hide coat on, the wide-brimmed hat, the hunting knife at his hip, and the size of him, in the orange and moving light, was something that registered differently outdoors than it did in a kitchen or a front room outdoors. There was nothing to make it relative, no ceiling or doorframe to give it scale. Just the open dark of a Montana night and a man who was too large for comfortable comparison to ordinary things. He went to Dusty first, got the corral gate open, moved the horse away from the burning coop with a hand along her neck and a word Ruth couldn't hear from where she stood. Dusty went because horses recognized something in how certain people moved, something at the level of bone and instinct that said this one knows what to do. Then Wade crossed to June's pen. The cow was pressing against the far corner, away from the heat, making no sound but with the wide-eyed stillness of an animal that had decided the best option was to become very small and very still and wait. Wade unlatched the pen gate and put his hand flat on June's flank and walked her out and away from the barn wall, the cow moving with the slow bovine dignity of an animal that had been led by humans enough times to understand it was the faster option, and Ruth thought, watching this from across the yard. He remembered June. He'd seen her in the pen every day for 2 weeks. He'd noticed which wall the pen shared with which structure. He'd done the calculation before the fire started. Then he turned to the 4 men. The 2 at the coop wall had straightened. The one near the road had drifted closer without appearing to decide to. The 4th she'd placed him now, to the left of the water trough, had gone very still in the particular way of men who were reassessing the situation they'd walked into. Wade looked at them the way he looked at everything that required a decision completely, in sequence, not letting urgency compress his attention. Then he began to walk toward them, no words first, no warning, just walking, with the same unhurried forward motion, each step placed deliberately in the frozen dirt. He didn't reach for the knife. He didn't raise his voice. He walked toward 4 men in the burning dark like a man walking toward a fence he intended to check, and something about the utter absence of theater in it, no posturing, no display. Just the calm forward motion of someone who had made a calculation and found the result unremarkable, made the 4 men do the thing that men did in the presence of something their instincts couldn't immediately categorize. They stopped moving. One of the men at the coop wall took a step back. Not consciously, it happened before he decided to do it, which Ruth could see clearly from where she stood. The man near the road gripped something at his belt. The 4th man, behind the trough, said something low that she couldn't make out. Wade stopped 8 feet from the nearest of them, looked at each face in turn. The firelight was behind him now, which meant he was a dark mass against the burning orange, which meant they were looking into something they couldn't fully see. "That's her coop," he said. Quiet, conversational in register, but with a density behind it that was not conversational at all. Her horse. Her land. He looked at each of them again. In sequence, unhurried. Whatever Pharaoh's paying you doesn't cover what happens if you don't leave right now. Not a shout. Not a threat shaped for effect. Just a man stating a sequence of events in the order they were going to occur, and leaving the listener to decide which part of the sequence they wanted to be present for. The man who had taken the involuntary step back took another one. The one near the road looked at the one who'd been behind the trough. That one looked at the man closest to Wade, who was doing a very good job of not showing that he wished he was somewhere else and not quite succeeding. Something passed between them, the rapid, wordless calculation of men who were paid to be dangerous but not to die, and who were looking at a man who appeared to have a different relationship to that distinction than they did. One of them turned and walked toward the road, then a second. The third waited another moment, jaw working through something, and then followed. The 4th, the one who had been behind the trough, looked at Wade for a full 3 seconds, something in the look that was equal parts defiance and honest appraisal, and then turned and left. The sound of their horses fading down the road was the only sound for a moment. Then the coop wall collapsed inward in a shower of orange sparks. And Ruth was already at the hand pump, and Wade was already there before her, and they worked in the dark and the cold to keep the fire-contained water from the trough. Dirt from the yard's edge thrown against the base of the barn wall where the heat was reaching. The systematic back and forth of 2 people working the same problem without needing to divide it or discuss it. By the time the barn wall was safe, the coop had burned down to its frame. June was in the paddock on the north side of the barn, as far from the fire as the property allowed, chewing with the meditative calm of a cow that had processed the evening's events and filed them under concluded. The hens had escaped into the yard and were clustered near the root cellar door in a tight, resentful group, unanimous in their disapproval. Ruth stood in the yard with the empty bucket in her hand and looked at the charred skeleton of the coop. She had built that structure herself the first spring after she married George, using cottonwood she'd cut from the stand along the creek. 4 weekends. Her own hands and no help that she could remember. She'd been proud of it in the particular way you were proud of something built from nothing by no one but yourself. Gone Wade came and stood beside her, close enough that she was aware of his warmth in the cold air, the warmth of exertion cooling slowly. He didn't say it was just a coop, or at least the barn was fine, or any of the reductive things people said to make other people's losses more manageable for everyone in the room. He stood there. Present, the way a fact was present. "They'll come back," she said. "Not these 4. But Pharaoh will send someone." He paused. "He knows I'm here now. Cobb will have told him. Which means tomorrow he makes the calculation about what that changes. What does it change?" He was quiet for a moment. "It tells him his original plan: isolate you, apply pressure, wait for the deadline, has a variable he didn't account for." He looked at the ruins of the coop. Men like Pharaoh don't adapt their plans. They accelerate them. She looked at the burned frame. At June standing placid in the north paddock, tail moving slow, entirely restored to herself. At least one thing had come through the night intact. "The hearing is in 9 days, she said. 9 days, he agreed. She went inside. He stayed in the yard to be certain the barn wall had cooled completely through, because that was the kind of thing he did. Made sure the thing was actually done before stopping doing it. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out at him in the dark, checking the barn wall with his palm in a slow, methodical sweep, and let herself understand clearly something she'd been not quite acknowledging for several days, which was that she didn't want him to leave, and the coop and the cracked ribs and the debt he felt he owed her had nothing to do with it. She went to bed before she could do anything useful with that understanding. In the morning she found the carving on the kitchen windowsill, finished overnight. The shape had been roughed out over the past week. She'd seen it develop in the evenings by firelight, but this was the completed thing, and the completed thing was a hawk. Wings spread at the moment of suspension between a downstroke and the next, the feathers individual and exact, each line made with the very tip of the belt knife. A small piece of pine resin, amber-colored, set into one eye and catching the morning light. She picked it up, turned it over. On the underside of the base, in small, careful letters pressed into the wood. For the woman who didn't walk away, she stood at the window for a while with the hawk in her hand and looked out at the yard, where Wade was already at work on the coop frame in the cold, his breath white, his movements carrying the quality she'd come to recognize as his particular baseline, deliberate, unhurried, entirely committed to whatever the task in front of him required. She put the hawk in her coat pocket, made coffee, made enough for two. When he came in, she had it on the table and breakfast starting, and he sat down and took the cup, and neither of them said anything about the hawk, which was the right way to treat something that had already said what it needed to say. 4 days before the hearing, Silas Cobb came to the ranch alone, not with men, not at night. He came at noon, on the gray mare, and stopped at the fence line and waited, which was itself new information. Cobb had always ridden to the door before. Stopping at the fence meant something was different about this visit, and Ruth understood that before she reached the gate. He held an envelope in his right hand, extended it toward her without dismounting. She did not take it. An offer, Cobb said. His voice was the same as always, flat and dry, all the weather removed from it. Market value for the property, plus forgiveness of the outstanding note. You'd leave with money and no debt. I don't have a debt, she said. The outstanding note reflects a figure that was never in the original instrument. Greer has the territorial filing showing the original number. Something in Cobb's face did a small thing. Not surprise, he'd presumably known about the Helena filing since Farrow knew. Something else. A reassessment, rapid and nearly invisible. Farrow is prepared to acknowledge there may have been a clerical error, he said. He's prepared to honor the original figure, $430, and forgive that amount as well, as a gesture of goodwill, if the sale proceeds. So Farrow was conceding the number, absorbing it entirely into the cost of the transaction, because it had stopped being useful as a lever. Which meant the land was what he'd wanted from the beginning, and the note had been machinery to move her toward it, and now that the machinery was broken, he was setting it aside and asking for the same thing more directly. No, Ruth said. Cobb's hand with the envelope stayed where it was, Mrs. Hadley. The answer is no, Mr. Cobb. It was always going to be no. I'd like you to make that clear to Farrow, along with the fact that I understand what my South 40 is worth now and what it will be worth when the Utah and Northern runs its spur through the valley. No number he puts on an envelope changes what the land is or who it belongs to. I'll see him in front of Judge Whitmore in 4 days. Cobb looked at her. Not the threat look, not the measuring look. Something she hadn't seen from him before. Farrow doesn't lose well, he said. Not as a threat. As information delivered without visible emotion, the way you told someone the temperature was going to drop. Men who get used to winning usually don't, she said. He was quiet for a moment. His hands on the reins were still. I worked for him 11 years, he said, which was not what she'd expected. She'd expected a harder close, something designed to produce fear or compliance. Instead, he sat the gray mare and looked at a fence post between them and said, 11 years is a long time to do a particular kind of work. There are things I've done for Clement Farrow that I've done because I was paid and because I didn't ask questions I could have asked. He paused. I want you to know I didn't send those men to burn your coop. He sent them on his own. He doesn't always tell me. She looked at him carefully. I can see you're deciding what to do with that, he said. I'm deciding, she agreed. I've never put fire to anything belonging to a woman on her own land, he said. I wanted that said somewhere, even if the somewhere is just you. He folded the envelope and put it back in his coat, gathered his reins. Whatever he does in the next 4 days won't come from me. That's all I can tell you." He turned the gray mare and rode back toward the road. Ruth watched him go and thought about men who drew lines inside themselves that they didn't announce until they had to, and what it cost them to hold those lines over 11 years of working for someone who didn't have any. She went inside and told Wade exactly what Cobb had said, in the order he'd said it. Wade listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "He's separating himself from what comes next," he said. "What comes next?" she said. "Farrow has 4 days and his offer was refused and the hearing is going to go badly for him." He met her eyes steadily. "What he does in those 4 days isn't going to be Silas Cobb." 3 days before the hearing, Farrow went after Greer's license. Not physically, Farrow was not a man who did things with his hands. He filed a complaint with the Territorial Bar Association, claiming Greer had engaged in fraudulent practice in connection with his prior career in Kansas, citing something from 1868 that had been in storage for 15 years and was now being presented as urgent and disqualifying. The complaint was thin in the way of things constructed quickly from available material rather than from actual wrongdoing. Greer's response, which he sent by telegraph to Helena at 6 the following morning, was 13 pages long and included the sworn statement of the judge who had presided over the 1868 matter, who was still alive in Topeka and still had detailed opinions about it. Greer brought a copy of his response to the ranch that afternoon, along with a copy of the original complaint, and sat at Ruth's kitchen table with the expression of a man who had just been handed an unexpected gift. "He's panicking," Greer said. He touched the complaint with one finger, not picking it up, just indicating it. "A man with a legitimate case attacks the opposing case. A man without one attacks the opposing attorney." He looked up. "He has nothing for the case. The Helena records are clean. Your copy is consistent with them. I now have affidavits from 5 of the 7 families showing the same pattern across multiple properties and multiple years. Farrow's version of events requires a court to believe that 7 separate people independently miscopied their own mortgage documents in the same direction by varying amounts over a period of 3 years." He folded his hands. "Whitmore is not a stupid man." "What happens to the complaint?" Ruth said. "The Bar Association will file it. Whitmore will hear about it because in a territory this size everything travels. And when he hears about it, he will understand exactly what he's looking at." Greer paused. "What concerns me more is the next 72 hours. Farrow will make one more direct move before the hearing. He's run out of indirect ones." He didn't elaborate on what that meant practically. He didn't need to. That night, Wade moved his bedroll from the barn to the front room without discussion, set it by the door, lay down with his coat over him and the belt knife within reach, and closed his eyes. Ruth looked at the arrangement for a moment. Then she went to her room and went to bed and felt, for the first time in the long string of difficult nights since October, that she was actually going to sleep. She slept. Nothing came that night. Or the next. Which in some ways was harder than if something had come, because the waiting had weight, and by the morning of the hearing Ruth had been carrying it in her shoulders and the back of her skull for days. She wore the navy wool dress she'd bought the year she and George had a good season, the one she'd spent money on before he could redirect it. She pinned her hair properly, looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand and thought, "This is what I look like when I mean it." Wade was at the kitchen table when she came out. He had trimmed his beard, not removed it, just shaped it back to something that suggested intention rather than the slow accumulation of years of not thinking about it. His shirt was clean. He'd done something with his hair. He still wore the deer-hide coat because it was the only coat he had, and he wore it with the same unconcerned authority he brought to everything, as though the question of what the coat said about him had never occurred to him as a question worth having. He looked at her when she came in. Looked for a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Ready," she said. "Ready," he said. They went to town, together in full daylight, and if the people on Dillon's Main Street went quiet when they came around the Cottonwood Bend, the widow Hadley, and the very large man in the worn deer-hide coat, walking with the particular ease of 2 people who had stopped negotiating each other's presence and simply accepted it, then they went quiet in their own way for their own reasons, and Ruth and Wade let them. Some things were best said by showing up and letting people decide what to do with it. The newspaper came out the morning of the hearing. Pearl brought it to the ranch at first light, which told Ruth what she needed to know before she opened it. Pearl did not make social calls before 7 in the morning. Page 2. Below the fold, but only just. The headline had been written by a man who knew exactly what he was implying and had arranged the words to imply it while maintaining technical innocence. Questions raised about land transactions in Dillon Flats area. Prominent rancher identified at Widow Hadley Profi. The article said nothing directly false. That was the craft of it. It noted that Wade Colton, proprietor of Broken Horn Ranch, the largest single land holding in Beaverhead County, had been observed at the property of widow Ruth Hadley, whose land abutted the area through which the proposed Utah and Northern Spur line was expected to run. It quoted unnamed local sources wondering whether Mrs. Hadley was fully aware of Mr. Colton's broader interests in the region's land. It mentioned in passing that Broken Horn Ranch had been largely unoccupied for 4 years. The reader was meant to supply the rest. The reader was meant to think, large rancher, grieving widow, valuable land, convenient timing. Ruth set the paper down. Wade was at the window, having read it first, holding it with the stillness of a man keeping something at a careful distance. Farrow wrote this himself, Pearl said, or told Chester Briggs at the paper what to write, which is the same thing. Ruth looked at Wade. He set the paper on the windowsill and turned from the window. His face had resolved from controlled to something more direct, with the quality of a decision that had been made some time ago and was simply being acknowledged. The hearing is in 3 hours, he said. What Farrow intends this to do to the hearing is less important than what we do with 3 hours. Greer, Ruth said. Greer already knows. He'd have seen this at dawn. He picked up his coat from the hook. And Pearl needs to reach Hetty Marsh before Hetty reads it on her own. Pearl was already putting her gloves on. Hetty Marsh, she said, with the crisp certainty of a woman who had already thought of this. He's going to read that article and become considerably more committed to November 20th than she already was. She looked at Ruth. I'll go to her. You go to Greer. At the door she paused and looked at Wade, with the direct assessing gaze she'd been running on him since the day Ruth first said his name. You're going into that church with her today? Yes, Wade said. In front of the entire town, yes. Pearl looked at him for another moment. The calculation in her eyes completed itself. Good, she said, and went out into the cold morning and didn't look back. Ruth looked at Wade across the kitchen. The article will be the first thing people talk about before the hearing starts, she said. Yes, Farrow will use it in the room. He'll try to make the hearing about you rather than about the records. He'll try, Wade said. Whitmore won't let him. He held her gaze. But even if Farrow tries, even if half that room looks at us the way that article wants them to look at us, the territorial records don't change. Greer's affidavits don't change. Clara Dunn's 2 pieces of paper don't change. He paused. What Farrow's doing this morning is throwing something at the wall because he's run out of walls to throw things at. Ruth looked at the paper on the windowsill. At the hawk on the kitchen shelf, the pine resin eye catching the early light. At Wade standing in her kitchen in his deer-hide coat, with the complete settled calm of a man who had decided something and was no longer in negotiation with the decision. She put on her coat. Let's go, she said. The church in Dillon held 90 people at capacity. By 9:15, it held closer to 120, because word had moved through the county in the particular wordless way of communities that had decided something mattered. Not announced. Not organized in any visible sense. Just known, the way things were known in places where people had been watching each other's land and weather and trouble for long enough that information traveled without needing a vehicle. Ruth had not expected this. She had expected the 7 families and Greer and Whitmore and whatever Farrow brought with him. She had not expected the Hendersons from the North Road, who had no stake in this specific matter but who came anyway and sat in the 3rd row with their hats in their laps. She had not expected 3 families from the east side of the valley whose names she barely knew. She had not expected, at the back of the room, a row of ranch hands, not landowners, not parties to any dispute, who had apparently come because they worked land that bordered disputed land and had views about men who believed they could own things by adjusting numbers. Pearl had done this. Ruth understood it immediately and completely. Pearl and Hetty Marsh, and the quiet, efficient machinery of what women in small towns knew and communicated and set in motion without it ever being formally called organizing. Greer was at the front table, his papers stacked with the precision of a man who understood that how you presented things said something about how seriously you took them. His white mustache was trimmed, finally, in honor of the occasion. Judge Whitmore sat at the church's small lectern, which had been moved to serve as a bench for the morning. He was a lean gray man of about 65, who held himself with the particular posture of someone who had been a judge long enough that authority had become simply a habit of the spine not performed. Just there, the way certain trees grew straight without anyone asking them to, he looked at the room without appearing to assess it, which was its own form of assessment. Pharaoh was there. Wool vest, watch chain. The smile calibrated precisely for an audience. The version Ruth had come to find most instructive, because it was the one he used when he believed the room was already his. He had an attorney beside him, someone brought from Beaverhead County. Young, with the forward-leaning confidence of a man who had not yet been wrong enough times to develop proper respect for being wrong. Silas Cobb was not in the room. Ruth noticed the absence and filed it without reacting to it. She and Wade came in together, Pearl and Greer and the 7 families behind them. The room made a sound when they entered, not loud, the sound of 120 people drawing breath at the same moment and then deciding how to release it. Some people looked at Wade with the expression the newspaper article had been designed to produce. Some looked at Ruth. Some looked at both of them with the more complicated expression of people who had known Ruth Hadley for years and were working to reconcile what they knew with what they'd been invited to suspect. Ruth did not look at anyone in particular. She walked to her seat behind Greer's table and sat down and put her hands flat on her knees and looked at Whitmore. Wade sat beside her. He took up the space he took up, which was considerable, and did not apologize for it. Greer opened. He was not theatrical about it. He presented the records in sequence, the 7 original mortgage instruments as filed with the territorial office in Helena, the 7 versions as represented by the bank's correspondents, the 7 letters of demand. He laid them on the table in order and walked Whitmore through the discrepancies without embellishment, because Amos Greer understood that the most devastating argument was the one that needed no flourish, just evidence, arranged carefully, doing its own work at its own pace. Pharaoh's attorney objected twice in the first 10 minutes. Whitmore overruled him both times with the patience of a man declining to be distracted by noise he has already categorized. When Greer finished, Whitmore set down the document he'd been reading and looked at Pharaoh's attorney. "Is the bank's position," he said in the measured cadence of a man who asked questions he already knew the answer to, "that the territorial filings in Helena are in error, or that the copies held by these 7 families are in error?" The attorney looked at Pharaoh. The look lasted slightly too long enough that the direction of it was visible to everyone in the room, long enough that it answered the question before the attorney opened his mouth. "The bank believes there may have been administrative discrepancies in the processing of certain instruments. I asked which records the bank contends are in error," Whitmore said, not sharply, with the flat precision of a man who would ask the question as many times as necessary. "The territorial filings or the copies held by the families." Another look at Pharaoh. Pharaoh's face was doing the thing faces did when the architecture behind them was under strain, holding its arrangement through will rather than ease. "The bank acknowledges," the attorney said, choosing each word with visible care, "that there may have been errors in the loan processing that require further review and—" "Thank you," Whitmore said, and looked away from the attorney entirely, which was the judicial equivalent of a door closing. The room made a sound, not loud. The particular low sound of 120 people arriving at the same conclusion simultaneously. Pharaoh stood. He didn't wait to be recognized. "Your Honor, I'd like to address the court directly." His voice was warm and measured and carried the acoustic confidence of a man who had used it effectively in rooms for 30 years. "These are serious allegations made against a bank that has served this community for over a decade, and I believe the court deserves to hear, Mr. Pharaoh." Whitmore's voice did not rise. It didn't need to. "You are represented by counsel. Your counsel will address this court. You will sit down." Pharaoh sat down. The room made a sound again. Smaller this time. More private. Pharaoh's attorney tried 3 more approaches over the next 40 minutes. He suggested the territorial records might themselves contain errors. He suggested the families had coordinated their testimony in a way that compromised its independence. He suggested that the presence of Wade Colton, he said the name with the deliberate emphasis of a man deploying a prepared argument, raised questions about the true nature of the opposition to the bank's position. Whitmore listened to each approach with the same even attention. Then he said, "Mr." and looked at the attorney's name on the document before him, Haynes. "The territorial records are maintained by the office of the territorial governor. They are not subject to the coordination of private citizens. And the question of who is sitting in this room beside Mrs. Hadley has no bearing on what the records in Helena say." He paused. "Is there additional evidence you'd like to present? Or shall we hear from the families?" They heard from the families. Hetty Marsh went first, because Hetty Marsh was not the kind of woman who waited to be called on. She stood and stated her name, and the particulars of Burtonard's note and the changed filing with the compressed precision of someone who had been holding this information under pressure for 2 years, and was now releasing it in controlled and deliberate increments. She didn't look at Farrow while she spoke. She didn't need to. The Connollys, the Bellamys, Vern Pruitt, who stood and spoke in the outdoor cadence of a man unused to rooms but clear about what he needed to say. And then Clara Dunn stood from the second row. She hadn't been called on either. Whitmore looked at her with the expression of a man deciding whether to redirect her and deciding against it. "My name is Clara Dunn," she said. Her voice was as clear and direct as her eyes. "I run sheep on the south end of the county. I'm not a complicated woman and I don't have a lawyer. But I have 2 pieces of paper that say 2 different things, and one of them came from my own hand and the other came from Farrow's bank, and they can't both be right." She held up both documents. "I've been frightened for 8 months about whether anyone would believe me. Because I'm one woman alone with sheep, and Clement Farrow is," she looked at him directly. Clement Farrow, she looked back at Whitmore. "I'd like someone to explain to me how a clerical error makes one number into a different number in the same direction, across 7 different properties over 3 years." The room was completely silent. Whitmore looked at Clara Dunn for a moment, then at Farrow, then at Farrow's attorney, who was looking at the table with the expression of a man who understood that his next words were going to be whatever he could find that was least damaging rather than anything resembling a defense. "I think," Whitmore said, in the tone of a man whose patience had traveled a long distance and arrived somewhere definitive, "that we are going to need to discuss this matter considerably further." He looked at Greer. "Your caution for injunctive relief?" "Filed this morning," Greer said. "Copy is on your table." Whitmore picked it up. "Read it without rushing. Set it down. The bank's foreclosure proceedings against all 7 properties are stayed, effective immediately, pending full investigation of the instruments in question." He looked at the room over his glasses, and then at each of the 7 families in sequence. "This is not a final determination, but no family here will lose their land to this bank while this investigation proceeds." He looked at Farrow. "Mr. Farrow, I'll need you in my office at 3 o'clock with all documentation related to these instruments. Mr. Cobb as well, if you can locate him." Ruth was watching Farrow's face when Whitmore said Cobb's name. The face held, but something behind it moved a rapid interior reassessment. The kind that happened when a variable you'd believed you controlled revealed itself to be operating independently. Farrow nodded, said nothing. His attorney gathered papers with the focused attention of a man who needed something to do with his hands. Ruth understood what Whitmore's mention of Cobb meant. Greer had put Cobb's name in the motion, she'd known that. But Whitmore was asking for Cobb by name, which meant Whitmore already had information about Cobb's role that had arrived through some channel other than this morning's hearing. Greer had been making connections she hadn't fully seen, because that was what Greer did, quietly and in sequence. Building a structure before he revealed it had a structure, the room began to move. People standing, the released sound of a crowd that had been held at tension and been given permission to be something else. Pearl appeared at Ruth's left elbow. Hetty Marsh was 3 feet to her right, standing with her arms at her sides and her face carrying the expression of a woman who had been vindicated and was taking a moment to feel the full weight of it before she did anything else with it. Ruth stood. And then from across the room through the crowd that was beginning to shift and separate, she saw Farrow looking at her. Not at Greer, not at Whitmore, at her. The smile was gone. What replaced it was not anger, not exactly something colder than anger and more considered. The look of a man who had revised his understanding of a situation and was already deciding what to do with the revision. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away. Because there was nothing more to say to him in this room, and because she had learned over the past weeks that the most powerful thing she could do in a room that Clement Farrow occupied was to make clear, without drama and without emphasis, that her attention had better places to be. Outside, the November air was sharp and clean after the close warmth of 120 people in a church. Ruth stood on the steps and breathed it. Greer came out behind her. He had the signed injunction in his hand, and his expression had the quality of a man who had done what he came to do and was already thinking about what came next. "The criminal referral goes to the county prosecutor today," he said. "Whitmore signs it this afternoon. That's separate from the civil hearing. It moves on its own schedule, and I can't promise you what it produces or when." He looked at her steadily. "But your land is protected as of this morning. All 7 properties." "Thank you, Amos," she said. He looked mildly uncomfortable with the directness of it, which she suspected was his usual response to gratitude. "Come see me Monday," he said. "We'll discuss the next steps in a room with chairs." He went down the steps and turned towards 2nd Street with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who had learned to be conservative with his left knee. Pearl was already in motion. Ruth could see her across the street, intercepting Hetty Marsh with the purposeful stride of a woman who had a next item and was moving toward it. The families were dispersing in clusters, talking in the low, animated way of people who had just been through something together and were still calibrating what they thought about it. Vern Pruitt stopped beside Ruth on the steps. He had his hat in his hands and he looked at it for a moment before looking at her. "I want you to know," he said, "that what you did standing up first, before you knew who else was going to, that took something." He was clearly uncomfortable with the speech but was delivering it anyway, which in Ruth's experience was the best kind, because it meant it was true rather than practiced. "I've been thinking about it since you came to my fence." Ruth thought about it for a moment. It took less than standing at a riverbank and not being able to do anything, she said, which was true in a way she hadn't fully understood until she heard herself say it. Vern Pruitt looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, nodded once, put his hat on and went down the steps. Wade was behind her. She'd known it without turning around, had developed over the past weeks a clear sense of where he was in any space, the way you developed a sense for load-bearing things not by thinking about it, just by being in proximity long enough for the knowledge to become automatic. She turned. He was looking at her with the directness he'd stopped attempting to conceal some time in the past week, not openly, not performed, just present it in his face the way things were present when a man had stopped managing them. Around them the street moved and made its noise, and neither of them was quite part of it in that moment. "It's not over," she said. Because it wasn't. Whitmore had said investigation, not resolution, and Farrow was across the street talking to his attorney with the body language of a man revising strategy rather than conceding anything. "No," Wade said, "but the thing you were most afraid of losing isn't going to be lost." He paused. "The rest is different work," which was not the same as finished. But it was true, and he said it the way he said true things without softening it into comfort or sharpening it into false certainty. Just the fact of it offered plainly. They walked back to the ranch together, dusty patient on the road, the Bitterroot visible through gaps in the cottonwoods, its upper slopes already white with the snow that would be down to the valley floor within the month. Ruth rode and thought about the South 40, about wheat, about what the land could be when the question of whether she'd keep it stopped being the question. "Farrow will make one more move," she said, "before Whitmore finalizes anything. Yes. Through the courts if he can. Around them if he can't. He'll try the courts first," Wade said. "He's a man who likes instruments, papers, things that look official." He paused. "When the courts don't move fast enough for him, he'll try something else. But by then Whitmore's investigation will be far enough along that whatever Farrow tries will look like what it is." Ruth looked at the road. Greer said the criminal referral moves on its own schedule. It does. But Farrow knows it's coming now. That changes his arithmetic. He rode for a moment. A man calculating whether to fight loses momentum when he understands the fight has already expanded beyond the terms he planned for. She looked at him. "You sound like you've thought about this kind of man before." "I've been one," he said. She waited. "Not the fraud," he said. the calculating. The belief that if you controlled enough of the variables, you controlled the outcome. He looked at the road ahead. I ran Broken Horn that way for 8 years, every contingency planned for, every variable accounted for. And then a storm came on a night I was in the North Range, and I came home the next morning and found that there are things no amount of planning reaches. He paused. A long pause, the kind that was doing real work. I stopped planning after that, stopped controlling, went up the mountain and did the opposite, which was to control nothing, account for nothing, have nothing that a storm could take. He looked at her. Neither of those things is actually how to live. Ruth held his gaze. What is? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, this, he said. What you did, plan what you can plan, fight what you can fight. And when something comes that you can't plan or fight, you don't go up a mountain. He looked at the road again. You find someone who'll stand in it with you. Ruth let that sit in the cold air between them. They rode the rest of the way home without talking much more. But the silence had the quality it had been building toward since the first night, not the silence of two strangers in a room, not the silence of a negotiation, but the silence of two people who had said the things that mattered and were now simply sharing the same space without needing to fill it. 2 weeks after the hearing, Farrow made his last move. He went after Greer's license. Ruth had half expected something physical, another night visit, another attempt at the barn, but Farrow was, in the end, a man of instruments. And his last instrument was a complaint filed with the Territorial Bar Association citing something from Greer's career in Kansas in 1868, resurrected from 15 years of storage and presented as newly urgent. It was thin, obviously constructed in haste from available material. The way a wall built quickly looked different from a wall built with time and attention. Greer's response, telegraphed to Helena the morning after the complaint arrived, was 13 pages and included the sworn statement of the judge from the original 1868 matter, who was alive in Topeka and had, it turned out, been waiting years for an opportunity to put his account of events into the official record. Greer brought copies of both documents to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon and laid them on the kitchen table. He's done, Greer said. Not with satisfaction exactly, it wasn't that kind of done. The kind of done that came when a thing had been decided by the accumulation of its own evidence, and there was no more argument to be made, only process to be completed. A man with a legitimate position attacks the argument. A man without one attacks the attorney. He touched the complaint with one finger. This tells me he has nothing left for the argument. The families, Ruth said. What about the 60 acres Bernard sold? A separate matter and a longer road. Greer was honest about it, because he was always honest about the things that required honesty, even when the honesty was uncomfortable. The criminal investigation may produce something that allows for restitution. It may not. I won't promise what I can't see clearly. He looked at her. What I can tell you is that December 1st passed without incident 3 days ago. The injunction held. Farrow made no move on that date because he couldn't. The court order prevented it. Your deed is secure while the investigation proceeds. Ruth had known this. She had watched December 1st come and go from the Broken Horn porch, with the particular attention of someone marking a date that had once seemed like a wall and had turned out to be a door that opened onto something else. She had not said anything about it to Wade that day, because there had been nothing to say. The date had passed. The land was still hers, and that was exactly what Greer had said would happen. But hearing it stated plainly, in Greer's office voice, in the kitchen where the bank letter had first been read, settled something in her chest that she hadn't known was still unsettled. And Whitmore's referral to the county prosecutor, she said, filed and accepted. Farrow's attorney is contesting the jurisdiction, which is a delay tactic and not a particularly good one. Greer picked up his hat. On the matter of Cobb, Whitmore met with him the afternoon of the hearing, as requested. Whatever Cobb said in that room, he said it in full and without qualification. Greer confirmed this to me in a letter 2 weeks ago without elaborating on the specifics, which means Cobb said things that were useful to the investigation, but that Whitmore considered sensitive enough to handle carefully. He paused. Cobb left Dillon in February. I don't know his destination and I haven't asked. Ruth thought about Cobb. About the line he'd drawn inside himself over 11 years, and the cost of holding it, and the specific way he'd stood at her fence and said, I've never put fire to anything belonging to a woman on her own land. Some debts were settled in courtrooms. Some were settled in other ways, quieter and less official, and the accounting of them was done by the person carrying them rather than by any external authority. "Come Monday," Greer said, already moving toward the door with the deliberate pace of a man who was conservative with his left knee. "We'll talk about the formal deed confirmation. The paperwork is almost ready." After he left, Ruth sat at the kitchen table for a while. Wade was outside. She could hear him at the new coupe frame. The rebuild was nearly done. Proper boards, reinforced foundation. A latch she'd chosen herself from the hardware catalog. She could hear the rhythm of his work, steady and unhurried, the sound that had become part of the background of the ranch, the way the windmill sound was part of it, the way the creek sound was part of it. She thought about George, not with the complicated tangle she'd been carrying for a year with something cleaner. George had been a careful man who believed that controlling things was the same as managing them, and who had discovered in the final weeks of his life that those were different things and had not known what to do with the discovery. She didn't hate him for it. She didn't particularly forgive him either, because forgiveness implied a scale of injury she wasn't sure she was working with anymore. Mostly she thought about the fact that the letter she'd found in his desk, the one that laid out his arrangement with Pharaoh, had been written by a man who believed he was protecting something. He'd been wrong about what needed protecting and wrong about the method, but the impulse, she thought, had not been entirely cold. The difference between George and Wade was not that one was a better man and one was worse. The difference was that Wade had been taken apart by loss and had let it take him apart, had lived with the pieces long enough to understand what each one was, and was now slowly, without announcing it, finding out whether they could be arranged differently. She went outside. Wade looked up from the coupe frame. She stood in the yard in the cold and looked at what he'd built. Solid structure, good framing. The latch she'd chosen hung straight and true on the new door. Beyond the new coupe, in the north paddock, June moved to the fence and regarded Ruth with the patient bovine attention of an animal that associated her presence with food and was optimistic about the situation. "The deed," Ruth said. "Greer wants to talk Monday," he nodded. "Whitmore's referral is with the county prosecutor." Cobb cooperated. Greer said he came forward fully. She paused. "He's left Dillon." Wade looked at the coupe frame. "Good," he said quietly. And she understood from the way he said it that he had thought about Cobb too, about the line and what it cost and what it meant when a man finally decided to stand on the right side of it, regardless of the consequences. "Pharaoh's not going to prison by Christmas," she said. "No," he met her eyes, "but he's not going to take anyone else's land either. Not in this county, not for a long time." He paused. "That's what you set out to do." She looked at the new coupe, at the yard, at the house behind her, the kitchen window with the hawk visible on the inside sill. "I need to go to the Marsh place," she said. "Tell Hetty in person what Greer said about the 60 acres. When, tomorrow morning, I'll go with you," he said. She looked at him. "You don't have to." "I know," he said, which by now they both understood was his way of saying that knowing he didn't have to was precisely why he was going to. On a Tuesday evening 3 weeks after the hearing, Wade set something on the kitchen table while Ruth was at the stove. She turned around when she heard it, the small sound of wood set on wood, and saw a carving beside the coffee cups. Not the hawk, something different. A house, small and exact, pitched roof and a door with a detail she had to look closely to see a hawk perched in the window frame, wings folded. The same hawk she'd put on the kitchen sill the morning she found it. She picked it up, turned it over. On the base, in the same small careful letters as the first CRH, the same initials as the ring. Different order. She set it on the table and looked at it. The fire in the main room made its sounds outside. The wind was working on something in the eave. She was aware of Wade standing across the kitchen with the stillness of a man who had made something that cost him something and placed it in front of someone and was now doing the thing he found hardest, which was to wait without filling the waiting. She looked up. "You started this before the hearing," she said. "It wasn't a question. A week before," he said. "Before you knew how it was going to go." "Yes." She looked at the house in her hand, at the hawk in the window. The detail was exact the same spread of the wings she'd been looking at on the sill for weeks. He'd reproduced it from memory, which meant he'd been looking at it that carefully, which meant something she let herself feel without trying to name it precisely. "Wade," she said. "Ruth," he said, "you have a ranch 2 days' ride from here. I do. You've been gone from it 4 years. Yes. Roy Hicks has been running it. Roy has been running it. A pause. Roy is a patient man. He knew I'd come down eventually. He didn't know when. He looked at his hands on the table, the ring on the right hand, BH and WC on the inside. I need to go back, not because of the ranch, though the ranch needs it too. Because Nora told me before she died that when I was ready to come back, everything would be waiting. He looked up. I've been deciding for a year what ready meant. I think I know now. Ruth was quiet for a moment. She thought about Nora Colton, whom she'd never met and knew only from what Wade had said, which was not much but was enough to construct the outline of a woman who had understood her husband in ways he hadn't understood himself, and had loved him with enough foresight to give him what he'd need after she was gone. She thought about what it meant to be offered a place in a life that had been built around an absence. The South 40, she said. My wheat. He looked at her steadily. I'm not giving up the South 40, she said. I just got it back, I know that. Or the house. The deed is mine, it is. Pearl is going to want to lease the pasture land when I'm not there to use it. She's already asked twice, Pearl, Wade said, with the careful neutrality of a man who had been in the county long enough to understand that Pearl Dawson was a force of nature that required acknowledgement rather than analysis. She'd take good care of it. I believe she would. Ruth looked at the house carving on the table, at the hawk in the window. She thought about 8 years of being kept at careful distance by someone who called the distance love. She thought about what it felt like when someone stood in a burning yard without flinching and then sat at your kitchen table afterward, as though that was simply the next thing, because for him it was. She thought about the specific way Wade listened, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually receiving what was said, which she had discovered over the past weeks was rarer than it should have been. Wade Colton? She said. Are you asking me something? He met her eyes. I'm working up to it, he said, which was the most honest thing he could have said, and they both knew it. She waited. He stood up from the table. 2 steps across the kitchen, which was all the kitchen required. He was very close, which required her to look up at the angle his height demanded, and she had stopped finding this remarkable some weeks ago, except in moments like this when she noticed it fresh. Ruth Hadley, he said, low and even. Will you come to Broken Horn? She looked at him. Is that all? No. He took a breath, and in the breath was the quality of a man who had been finding his way toward something for a long time and had arrived. Come to Broken Horn and stay. Let me try to be the kind of man who deserves someone who would walk into a November blizzard to pull a stranger out of the snow. I'm not fast at things like this. I've never been, he paused, but I don't quit, and I'll be there in the morning. She had known this about him from the second day, when she came in from the barn and found the hinge fixed and him sitting against the hearth, with the expression of a man who had done the thing and wasn't looking for comment about it. Pearl gets the pasture lease, she said. Yes, and the house stays in my name, it stays in your name, and Dusty gets the best stall at Broken Horn. Something happened in his face. Not quite a smile, the real thing. The one she'd heard once in the dark on the road home from the hearing and hadn't heard since, surprised out of him again now. Done, he said. Roy Hicks has already been told. She looked at him. You told Roy Hicks? I sent a telegraph last week. I told him I was coming back, and I was bringing someone and to get the east stall ready. He held her gaze. I told him her horse was particular about her accommodations. Ruth stared at him for a moment. Then she laughed, not the polite kind, not the controlled kind, but the real kind that came from the place below the ribs where genuine things lived. The kind she hadn't let herself have in a long time, because there hadn't been enough room for it alongside everything else. When it passed, she looked at him, and he was looking back at her with the expression she'd been trying to name for weeks, and could now name clearly. The look of a man who has found the thing he stopped believing he would find, and is standing very still in the presence of it, so as not to startle it away. She put her hand on his chest. She could feel the steadiness of his breathing under her palm, slow and even, the rhythm of someone who had learned to be present in his own body again after years of treating it as something to be endured. He put his hand over hers, not pulling her closer, just holding. I want to go see the room, she said, at Broken Horn. Before we decide anything else, he understood what she meant. Nora's room, he said. Your room. That's been closed for 4 years. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face, not grief, not exactly, but the cousin of grief. The feeling that came when you reached for something you'd been keeping carefully sealed and found it was different than you'd been imagining it would be. Smaller, maybe. More survivable. All right, he said. Not tonight, she said. When we get there, he agreed. She took her hand back, picked up the house carving from the table and set it beside the hawk on the kitchen sill, the two carvings together in the window where the morning light would find them. Tell Roy Hicks we'll be there by Thursday, she said, and went back to the stove. Roy Hicks was at the gate when they rode in, not waiting working. He was replacing a hinge on the main gate post when they came up the road, and he straightened when he heard the horses and looked at them both without apparent surprise, which told Ruth something about him before he opened his mouth. He was somewhere in his 50s, compact and deliberate, with the tanned, weathered face of a man who had been outdoors for a long time, and had long since made his peace with what the outdoors did to a face. He looked at Wade. "You look better than I expected," he said. "You expected worse," Wade said. "You were gone 4 years. I expected to be identifying a body." Roy Hicks shifted his attention to Ruth. Roy Hicks? He didn't extend his hand immediately. He was holding a hinge pin, but the directness of his gaze was its own form of introduction. "You're the one who pulled him out of the snow." "Yes," Ruth said. Roy looked at her for a moment with the evaluating attention of a man who took stock of things carefully and did not revise his assessments without reason. Then he nodded. Once. The nod of a man who had filed something under the correct category. "East stalls ready," he said to Ruth. "Plenty of room. I put extra bedding down." She looked at him. "You don't know what kind of horse she is yet." "Wade's telegraph said she was particular," Roy said. "I've dealt with particular before." He picked up the hinge and turned back to the gatepost. "House is aired out. I had the windows open yesterday while the weather held. Supper's on the stove, it'll keep until you're ready." He drove the hinge pin with 3 precise strikes of his mallet. "Good to have you back," he said, to the gatepost apparently, but not to the gatepost. Wade looked at him for a moment. "Good to be back." Roy, that was all that was said about 4 years. Broken Horn Ranch was larger than Ruth had imagined, which was saying something because she'd had a month to imagine it. The house was solid and wide, built with the materials of a man who intended permanent stone foundation, heavy timber framing, a porch that ran the full width of the front and looked south over the valley. The barns were proportioned for the operation they housed, not oversized for show but exactly the size of what they needed to be, which told her something about how the ranch had been built and by whom. She settled Dusty in the east stall while Wade spoke to Roy in the yard. Dusty assessed the stall with the critical attention she brought to all new accommodations, investigated the hay, nosed the water trough, and then produced a sigh that Ruth chose to interpret as provisional approval. "Fair enough," Ruth told the horse, in the tone she'd developed for Dusty's more theatrical moments. That evening, after supper, Roy's beef stew, which was straightforward and good, and not trying to be anything more than what it was. Ruth and Wade went down the hall to the closed door. It was a plain door. Nothing marked it as different from the other doors in the house. But it had the quality of closed things that had been closed a long time, a slight resistance in the air around it, the way a room felt when it had been holding its breath. Wade stood at the door for a moment. Ruth stood beside him, not close enough to crowd, close enough to be present. He opened it. The room was simple. Clean Roy had aired it along with the rest of the house, and the November cold had gone through it and come out the other side and left it smelling of cedar and nothing else. A bed with a blue and white quilt, a dresser, a window looking east toward the first light of mornings. On the dresser, a small glass bottle of the kind that might have held lavender water, empty now, but still faintly holding the memory of its scent. Wade stood in the doorway and looked at the room for a long time. Ruth did not say anything. She had learned enough, in the past weeks, to understand when silence was the right contribution. Finally, he said, "She told me once that a house could feel when someone loved it." He looked at the quilt, the dresser, the window. "She said houses had a kind of memory." Ruth looked at the room, at the simple arrangements of a woman who had put her care into things that would last. "Then this one remembers her," she said. "That's not a sad thing." He looked at the window. "No," he said slowly, like a man testing the truth of something he'd been told from the outside and was now discovering from the inside. "It's not." He stepped into the room, stood at the window, looked east toward the dark. Ruth stayed in the doorway. After a while he turned around. He looked different standing in that room than he'd looked anywhere else, not diminished, but altered in some way she'd have to find words for later. Lighter, maybe, as though something that had been carried at a fixed elevation had been set down properly for the first time. Nora told me before she died, he said, that when I was ready to come back, everything I'd built would be waiting. He paused. I thought for a long time she meant the ranch. Ruth waited. I think she meant something else, he said. Ruth looked at him across the room. At the man who had been in the snow and had come out of it, who had fixed things without being asked and stood between her and what was coming and carved small perfect things by firelight and said what he meant in plain words when he finally said it. Come out of that room, she said quietly, and close the door. He came out of the room, closed the door, stood in the hall. She took his hand, both of hers around one of his, the same hand with the ring, and held it for a moment. Then she turned and walked back toward the warm part of the house, and he walked beside her. And behind them the closed door held its memories as closed doors did, and ahead of them the stove was still warm, and Roy Hicks had left the lamp burning in the kitchen, and through the window the Montana stars were doing what they had always done, which was to be numerous and indifferent, and somehow, despite the indifference, a reliable form of company. Spring came to Broken Horn the way spring came to that part of Montana, not gently, but with a conviction that winter had argued against for months and finally lost. The snow on the Bitterroot's upper slopes held until April, but in the valley the ground softened by degrees, and then all at once, and the creek ran high and cold and clear, and the aspens along its banks went from bare to tentative to the sudden urgent green of things that had been waiting a long time and were not wasting the opportunity. Ruth put wheat in the South 40 in April. Real wheat on the good soil by the creek boundary, where the water table sat high and the ground had been building itself for years. 2 hired hands from the east side of the county helped with the planting, both of them recommended by Roy Hicks and confirmed by Ruth's own 3-day assessment before she discussed wages. Wade worked the north end of the acreage and she worked the south end, and Roy managed the equipment, and by the end of the first week there were 3 weeks of work behind them, and the smell of turned soil was in everything. She rode back to Dillon once a week. Pearl had the pasture lease formalized through Greer's office and was already using the land for the overflow from her kitchen garden, which had apparently become significantly more ambitious since having additional acreage to expand into. The house stood as it had always stood, the kitchen window catching the morning light, the Hornthzill visible through the glass. Ruth had left the hawk there. She'd thought about bringing it to Broken Horn and had decided against it. The hawk belonged to that house, to that window, to the morning she'd found it and understood that something was changing in a direction she hadn't chosen and couldn't have predicted and was not going to run from. Greer sent a letter in March. The county prosecutor had filed charges. Farrow had retained an attorney from outside the territory. The process would take time. Greer said this plainly and without false comfort, because he was not a man who offered false comfort, but the structure of the case was solid and the territorial records were not going anywhere. Bernard Marsh, it turned out, had been corresponding with the county prosecutor independently. Ruth found this out from Pearl, who found everything out before anyone else found anything out. Bernard had provided documentation of the 60-acre sale and the circumstances around it, and had done so, according to Pearl, with the deliberate thoroughness of a man who had been quiet for 2 years and had finished being quiet. Hetty had said nothing about it to anyone, which meant she had known and had chosen not to direct it, which meant it had been Bernard's decision made in Bernard's own time, which Pearl seemed to consider the proper resolution of something that had needed resolving. Silas Cobb was not charged with anything. He had come forward voluntarily in February and provided a sworn account of his years working for Farrow, including a clear statement of what he had done and had not done, which was verified against other accounts and found to be accurate in its distinctions. He had left Dillon by March, and Ruth did not know where he went and did not ask. She thought about him occasionally, about the line he'd drawn inside himself over 11 years, about what it cost to hold a line like that, about whether the accounting of a life came out differently when you added up what you'd refused alongside what you'd done. She thought the accounting probably depended on who was doing it. On an evening in May, late enough in the month that the days had real warmth in them, and the wheat in the South 40 was showing its first tentative rows of green. Ruth sat on the broken horn porch with the account book for the spring planting. The numbers were not comfortable, yet they rarely were in the first year of a new crop, but they were honest, which was what she asked of numbers. Wade came out and sat beside her. He'd been with Roy looking at the east herd, which had come through the winter better than expected and was going into spring calving in good condition. He had the particular settled look of a man who had been doing work he understood and found it still fit him, which was not the same as it had been 4 years ago. Better, in some way that was hard to name, but was in the quality of his presence, the way he inhabited his own body without the underlying tension of a man who is treating himself as a problem. He looked at the account book. South 40? First month. It'll be a year before the numbers look like anything useful. They'll get there, I know. She closed the book, looked out at the valley. The last of the day's light was doing what it did in that country at that time of year, going golden and long across the grassland, making everything it touched look like it had been waiting all day for exactly this quality of attention. She put her hand on her stomach, not dramatically, just resting it there, the way you rested a hand on something you were getting used to knowing. Wade looked at her hand, then at her face. She met his eyes. He was very still for a moment, the particular stillness that preceded a feeling that was too huge to arrive all at once and had to come in stages. She watched it arrive in stages, watched something behind his eyes reorganize itself around a new and irreversible fact, the way a room reorganized around furniture that had been moved, everything the same but nothing in the same place. "Ruth," he said. "Yes," she said, which answered the question he hadn't finished asking. He sat with that for a moment. Then he put his arm around her, his hand at her shoulder. And she leaned into the solid warmth of him, and they sat on the broken horn porch and looked out at the wheat showing green in the South 40, and the bitterroot beyond it, holding its snow on the high slopes, and the evening doing what evenings did in that country, which was to take everything the day had been and make it quiet. After a while he said, "Roy's going to be insufferable about this." Ruth laughed the real kind, from below the ribs. "Pearl's going to be worse. Pearl's going to organize something. Pearl's going to organize several things." She paused. "And she's going to be right about all of them, which will make it impossible to object." Wade made a sound beside her that was agreement and resignation, and something that was close to contentment, which was a word she would not have applied to him 3 months ago, and could apply now without reservation. The light went the rest of the way down. The stars came out over the bitterroot, the same stars that had been over Dillon Flats the night she sat on her own porch with Farrow's letter in her coat pocket, and the well tracks in the snow, and no idea what was coming from the north. She thought about that woman on that porch, and about the walk into the trees the next morning, and about the specific quality of the moment she'd seen the man on the ground under the pine, the arguments she'd had with herself in 15 seconds, and what had won them. Not bravery, not calculation, just the inability to look at something that needed doing and keep walking. The hawk on the sill of the Dillon house had said it more precisely than she could have. For the woman who didn't walk away. As though walking away had been a real option, something she'd genuinely weighed and declined. She supposed it had been. She supposed she'd declined it the moment she dismounted. She had not regretted it once. Inside, Roy Hicks was making something in the kitchen that smelled of coffee and scorched butter, which was his version of an evening meal when he was cooking for company and was trying. Dusty was in the east stall with the extra bedding that Roy had put down and had not removed since November. The wheat was in the South 40. The deed was in Greer's office with a copy on the shelf in the Broken Horn study, and both copies said what they had always been meant to say, and beside her on the porch was a man who had been in the snow and had come back from it, who had put his hands to everything that needed doing without being asked, and had stood between her and what was coming, and had carved small, perfect things by firelight, and had looked at her across a kitchen table with the ring on his hand and meant every word he'd said. She had been alone for a long time, in the particular way you could be alone inside a life that looked complete from the outside. She understood now that this was the difference between a life that looked complete and a life that actually was, and that the difference was usually a person, and that the person was usually unexpected, and that the unexpectedness was not a problem to be managed, but a thing to be grateful for on the evenings when you could see the wheat coming in and the stars coming out, and you had enough good sense to sit still and pay attention. She leaned into Wade's side. He tightened his arm at her shoulder. The Bitterroot held its snow, the valley held its quiet, and in the east stall of Broken Horn Ranch, Dusty produced one final sigh of the evening, which echoed briefly in the barn, and then was absorbed into the ordinary sounds of a working ranch going about its business, which was the best sound Ruth Hadley had ever heard.